Hello everyone, this is Himdad A.Muhammad presenting a series of lectures on translation module under the title Translation Theory and Practice. This is lesson number 1. In this lesson we would be talking about an introduction and then historical background, and then we will be talking about the significance and importance of translation. Then we will present some definitions chronologically based on the years of their presentation and publication, and then we will be talking about characteristics of a good translator and then characteristics of a good translation, and here we will finish from the first lesson. If we start from an introduction, we have to ask ourselves, why do we translate, and whether translation is an art or a science or a craft. This is a controversial question that cannot be very easily answered and approached. It could be a science because definitely there are some rules that govern this kind of process called translation, but on the other hand it could be called an art because it needs some skills from the translator's part, because the word choice, the grammatical structures, the styles and the structures that the translator uses is his choice. So the more artful, the more skillful the translator, the better the translation product would be. That's why sometimes people confuse between the two, whether translation can be considered an art or it is a profession. But as I said, translation could be a craft for the amateurs and for the machine, because we have also something called machine translation. So to them it is a science, it is a craft. Why? Because it needs algorithms, it needs rules, so that this machine or that craftsperson should follow in order to get the product that he is desiring. But because it is not only that, in translation you have the choice, the translator has the choice to make among the many words and vocabularies that he has available in that language, and the grammatical structures and the constructions are all his choice. So that's why I believe I go for a translation being more of an art than of a science. And when we say it is more of an art, we mean that it could be progressed, it could be promoted and developed through practice. So the role of practice is very important in the field of translation. If you want to be better and better, you need to practice more and more. If it is a science, then it cannot be affected by practice. But since it is more of an art, then the role of practice is very important. And another point is good translators or translators need to be bicultural people or bicultural persons. We will come back to this point when we talk about the characteristics of a good translator, because language is a part of culture, and then if a translator is not well acquainted with both cultures, he cannot translate any text or any stretch of language, whether spoken or written, in a good way, because culture is reflected in language also. If we come to the origin of the term translation, it consists of two parts. First, it is a Latin origin, and the first part is trans, which means across or through, and the second part is late, which means carry or bear. So this trans as a kind of prefix is repeated in several other words. For example, transportation, transfer, transplant. So whatever word has trans in it, it means across or through. And late would be carrying or bearing. When we do translation, there are two important things to remember. We have something called source language, the language of the origin, and target language, the language of the target. That's the one you translate into. So simply we can say now that translation is the replacement of words in one language to another, or transfer of meaning from one language to another. I think this would be enough for the introductory part, and then we will go into details when we give several definitions, and then you can come up with your own definition. And then if we address this question to yourself or to anybody who is working in the field of translation, say, is translation easy? Is it an easy task? Is it an easy work or job? Definitely we can say it is not easy, and simply because usually cultures have differences, so languages also have differences. Languages are not identical, so translators face difficulty and problems and challenges when they do translations because of these cultural differences. And then there are linguistic discrepancies or linguistic differences between the languages. So what is true for a language like English might not be true for a language like Kurdish, even though they come from the same family. So there are definitely linguistic discrepancies between the two languages. We talked about English and Kurdish as an example for that. For example, in English, there is no sentence, no ordinary sentence that is without a subject, because English language is a non-pro-drop language. So a sentence cannot stand alone without having a subject. While in Kurdish, this could be possible, and there are sentences in Kurdish that are without subjects. And again, in the structure of the sentences, for example, an English sentence, he went to school, you see that went is in the middle, because the English sentence structure is S, subject, verb, and then object. While in Kurdish, the structure is not like that. It is not similar. In Kurdish, it is S-O-V. So Kurdish is a verb-last language. The verb comes at the end of the sentence, not in the middle of the sentence. Because of these two problems and challenges, like cultural differences and linguistic discrepancies, we can say that translation is not easy. But remember, we say it is not easy. We don't say it is impossible. It is possible, and there are very good translation pieces, translation samples, and very good and renowned translators all over the world. If we come to talk about the importance and significance of translation, we can see that the importance of translation is multidimensional. It could be approached from different dimensions and from different perspectives. For example, if we come up with the industry field, we see that nowadays translation has become a very good and profitable industry around the world, because now translating documents, written material and paper-based documents is now a business. Interpreting services and sign language services is a business of its own. Digital documentation translation, it is a business also. Software translation and website translation, which is sometimes termed as localizations, are very profitable businesses internationally around the world. There are many agencies, many companies, many industries based on the translation work. So this is one of the importances of translation. The second, translation is important because several times, on several occasions, we come across gaps of communication between people from different nations, from different countries. So translation is very good to bridge that communication gap. And then translation, or through translation, we can have a cultural exchange or interchange between different cultures and different communities. And translation could be also used in order to promote and develop a nation's external affairs, international relations and public relations of a nation or a country is usually done through translations or translators. And another point of that shows the importance of translation is the accurate and true transfer of news to the people and to the community. And translation could lead to boosting in tourism, and then it comes up with the growth of multinational companies. Nowadays there are several companies that are multinational, and they are depending on translation services or translators. If we want to give a brief background of historical background of the development of translation and translation theory, we can just simply point some landmarks in the process of the development of translation. In ancient times, in ancient history, when people and tradesmen specifically, when they traveled to different areas and different regions where they didn't have and they didn't know these languages, what did they do? They resorted to translators and translation and maybe notebooks and so on, so that they do their daily jobs. So this could be the beginning of the establishment of theory of translation and translation craft. Erik Jacobsen claims that translation is a Roman invention, although translation is as old as language itself. So the origin of translation could be dated back to the origin of language, because people spoke different languages, so definitely they were in need of some kind of translation, even though it was very simple at the beginning. If we go to the West or Western world, the first important translation in the West was that of the Septuagint, a collection of Jewish scriptures that were translated into early Koine Greek in Alexandria between the 3rd and the 1st centuries BC. If you think of this date, 3rd and 1st centuries BC or before Christ, you see how old is translation. And then in the advent of the cultures and civilizations, and especially one important factor in the around 15th century, it was the invention of the printing press, which had a very profound impact on literacy in general. And before, most of the written texts was in Latin, but the invention of the printing press has opened doors for other languages and for textbooks to be printed and for translations to be spread around the world. The Western world was also very importantly involved in what is called creative approach to translation, because this was called the period of adaptations, where there was little attention given to accuracy. They were translating things, books of thought, even religious books, and of that thinkers and philosophers of that time, based on their individual interest and individual preferences. For example, when the poet John Dryden went to translate some of the Virgil's poems, he had himself used the words that were used among the Englishmen, so he was not very strictly bound by the text itself. He wanted to make it English, but used the diction and the words and the images that were familiar to the Englishmen at that time. And then the translation of the material into Arabic, if we come to the Islamic world, for example, for a second, we see that it has started from the 5th century, where the Arabic script was created, and then the Arab translators initially focused primarily on politics, and they were going to languages as Persian, Greek, and Chinese. It was later that the Arab translators turned their focus into the works of the classical Greek and the Persian words and the Chinese and even the Indian texts. There are very well-known Islamic and Arab figures in the field of translation. For example, Al-Azhar in Cairo, Al-Nizamiya of Baghdad. These were kind of Islamic learning centers that have worked on translation very seriously, and they were translating tens of books continuously in order to feed the minds of people with the knowledge of that time. And then in the 1950s of the 20th century, the academic discipline of translation studies has become an established concept. But if we come to the modern theories, we see that now we have computer-aided translations, we have translation memory tools, we have even machine translation, and so on. So this was just a quick review of the history of the development of translation across the history. I think now it is time to come to definitions of translation. Translation does not yield itself to one single definition. So in order to get a better idea or a clearer picture of what translation is, we have to give several definitions, and then we have to come up with the common points in these definitions, and then we can work on our own definition of translation, because everyone looks at it from his own perspective or from his intentions perspective or intentions angle. The first thing we talk about Foster's definition in 1958. He says that translation is a mental activity in which a meaning of given linguistic discourse is rendered from one language to another. So here we can say that it is the act of transferring linguistic entities from one language into their equivalents into another language. So translation is an act through which the content of a text is transferred from the source language into the target language. This is the definition of Foster, which was presented in 1958. On the other hand, Peter Newmark in 1981 says that translation is an attempt to replace a message or a statement in one language by the same message or statement in another language. Catford revised his definitions previously because, as I said, he is very renowned in the field of translation studies, and he provides another definition to translation, and he says translation is the replacement of a textual material in one language by equivalent textual material in another language. And finally, House in 2009 says translation is a process of replacing a text in one language of a text in another language. Now, if we think of these definitions all together, what do you come up with? There are several common points between them. So, what all definitions agree on are the following points. First, there are two extremes at the same time. In one extreme, there is what is called the demands of the source language, and on the other extreme, the demands of the target language. So we have source language and target language. And then we can see that in the definitions there are two processes. There is an expression process from the first original text, and this involves thinking, and then the second process when it comes to translating it and trying to rethink or re-express it in the target language texts or target language elements. So there are thinking and rethinking, expressing and re-expressing. And the last point, the common point between them, is the importance of the equivalence. So equivalent in terms of context, equivalence in terms of semantics, of grammar, and of lexemes and lexemes. And at different ranks, at different levels, for example, word for sentence, and in different degrees, for example, fully translated or partially, fully equivalent or partially equivalent. Now I guess you have the chance now to come up with your own definitions of translation. You can make use of the previous definitions and try to pick from each one the strong points or the points that you see good and strong. If we come to characteristics of a good translation, they could be summarized in some points. Any translation, in order to be successful, in order to be good, must be informative, must give information, must give sufficient information to the reader, and must be communicative. It should communicate a message or the message that was imparted in the original text. It should be accurate and it should be natural. It should have the feature of naturalness. I mean, you cannot translate a text from English into Kurdish, but the style of writing is still English. You have to use a style of Kurdish, that's the target language, that's naturally spoken and used by Kurdish people and members of the Kurdish community. And the last point that some scholars add is a good translation should be rhetorical also. And this is more applicable to literary translations. This brings us to another point: who is a good translator, or what are the characteristics of a good translator? There are two important points that we have to keep in mind. It could be expressed in two words, but there are several details in it. A good translator must be bilingual. When we say bilingual, he needs to know the two languages, source language and target language, profoundly, and to be acquainted with the language from all aspects, from vocabularies, grammar, and even pronunciation and meaning also, and the idiomatic expressions, the metaphorical expressions, and so on, because all these constitute the language. It's not just speaking the language. A good translator must be a master of both languages, not only one of them. The second characteristic of a good translator is called bicultural. A good translator should not only speak the languages, should not only know the two languages, but he should be aware of the two cultures. The culture that he is translating from and the culture that he is translating into. Because we said that language and culture are very closely interrelated. There are several reflections of culture in language. So if a translator is not aware of both cultures, the source language culture and the target language culture, he will not be successful in his work. Thank you for listening. That would be enough for lesson 1 of the translation module series entitled Translation Theory and Practice. Wait for other lessons, and thank you for listening.